It began with smoke rising into the pale French sky, not from the battlefield, nor from the hearths of a grieving city, but from a wooden platform hastily constructed in the marketplace of Rouen. There stood a woman in chains, a queen no longer, her garments soiled and torn, her hair cropped to humiliate, her eyes wide with horror, not for herself, but for the figures beside her, her children, her sons, young boys trembling with confusion, still wearing the noble emblems of their fallen house. The air reeked of scorched flesh before the fire was even lit, as if the executioner's torch had already summoned death itself to wait in silence. The crowd gathered not in protest, not even in curiosity, but in the cold detachment of those who have long grown used to the rituals of political destruction. And there, in the final moments before the flames climbed their way toward innocence, a cry pierced the sky, not from the boys, but from their mother, Madeleine de la Tour d'Auvergne, the widow of a traitor, the branded wife of rebellion, the woman who had watched her world crumble piece by piece, until all that remained was her blood, and the fire that would consume it. To the court chroniclers, this moment would become a note of necessity, a punishment decreed by sovereign justice in the war-torn throes of the 16th century. To the survivors of the French wars of religion, it was merely another footnote in the endless ledger of atrocities. But the truth buried beneath the smoke was far darker. This was not justice, but vengeance disguised as law. The burning of her sons was not a punishment for their crimes. They had committed none, but a final blow meant to erase a name, an alliance, and a legacy. It was a spectacle, a message, and most cruelly a performance staged for the benefit of political theater. For Madeleine, the agony was not in the fire. It was in her powerlessness, in the long, slow collapse that had brought her to this point. Once the noble consort of a powerful prince, now made to kneel as executioners placed her children atop the pyre. What history remembered as punishment was, in fact, the climax of a methodical campaign of cruelty, a slow unraveling of identity, dignity, and motherhood in the name of national unity. To understand how a queen came to watch her own blood burn alive, one must go back to the beginning of her story, to the marriage that sealed her fate, and to the man who would drag her from a palace to the gallows with his love, ambition, and betrayal. Born in the year 1510 into the powerful house of La Tour d'Auvergne, Madeleine was the only daughter of one of France's oldest noble bloodlines. Her family held lands in the mountainous Auvergne region, commanding both political respect and military strength. As a child, she was educated not only in Latin and theology, but also in diplomacy, groomed for marriage as all noble daughters were, trained to speak softly, to calculate quickly, and to remain silent when it mattered most. Her beauty was remarked upon in court, but it was her intelligence that drew attention, especially the attention of Antoine de Bourbon, the ambitious head of the Bourbon family, a man who dreamed not just of alliance, but of kingship. Their marriage in 1538 was a political union cloaked in poetry, a celebration of reconciliation between two ancient houses whose combined strength could shift the balance of the kingdom. For Madeleine, it was the beginning of her queenly illusion. For Antoine, it was the first stone laid on the path toward power, a path that would eventually trample everything they built together. In the first years of their union, Madeleine bore Antoine several children, among them the boys who would later be known not as heirs, but as martyrs. She raised them within the walled gardens of Navarre, among tutors, priests, and guards. Her world, though gilded, was built on tension. France was splintering, torn between Catholic orthodoxy and the rising tide of Protestant reform. Her husband, a man whose loyalties shifted with the wind, played both sides as needed, professing loyalty to the Catholic crown while courting Protestant allies behind closed doors. Madeleine, devout and pragmatic, watched her children grow, not in the shadow of safety, but in the eye of a storm. By the 1550s, the wars of religion had begun to consume France from within. Her husband declared himself aligned with the Protestant Huguenots, seeking to crown himself King of Navarre with full independence from Paris. What he did not foresee, or perhaps did not care to imagine, was the cost this rebellion would demand from his family, and from the woman he once called his queen. When Antoine took up arms in open defiance of the French crown in 1560, he dragged his wife and sons into a war that would show no mercy to traitors, no pity to their children. As the conflict intensified, Madeleine was no longer the consort of a prince, but the wife of a declared rebel. Their estates were seized, their allies scattered or slain, and their reputation blackened across every Catholic court in Europe. She fled with her children from castle to castle, hounded by royal forces, denounced in pamphlets, and shunned by former friends. Her identity, once forged in nobility, began to fracture under the strain of survival. In 1562, Antoine was killed in battle, struck down by a Catholic musket while trying to rally Protestant troops outside Rouen. His death did not bring peace. It brought wrath. The crown now had no reason to show clemency. With the rebel prince dead, the only targets left were his wife and his sons. The arrest came at dawn. Soldiers broke down the doors of the monastery where Madeleine had taken refuge, dragging her from the chapel floor and tearing the boys from her arms. She pleaded with the officer, a man who once served in her husband's guard, but his orders were clear: deliver the traitor's widow and her children to Rouen for trial. The charges were formal: conspiracy, heresy, treason. But the sentence had been written long before. The crown did not want truth. It wanted erasure. It wanted to make an example so severe, so unforgettable, that no noble house would ever again dare to raise arms against Paris. What awaited Madeleine and her sons in Rouen was not a trial, but a stage, not for justice, but for terror. They were not prisoners. They were actors in a scene composed for blood, fire, and silence. The journey to Rouen was more like a funeral procession than a prisoner's transfer. Bound in iron, Madeleine rode in a wooden cart behind her sons, who were forced to walk on foot, barefoot, exposed to the cold and jeering crowds that had gathered along the roadside like vultures circling a battlefield. The younger boy, not yet 10, stumbled and fell several times before a soldier struck him to force him upright. Madeleine could not cry out. She had learned by then that protest only invited cruelty. In the silence of her imprisonment, she began to unravel the meaning of fate, not as divine justice, but as the weapon of kings, wielded not with fairness, but with convenience. In Rouen, they were not placed in prison, but in holding cells beneath the bishop's palace, where rats scurried through straw and the walls wept with moisture. The boys were kept in a separate chamber, guarded night and day, forbidden from seeing their mother except during interrogations. These interrogations were not conducted with civility. Royal inquisitors, men cloaked in both religious authority and political mandate, questioned Madeleine about her husband's final strategies, the letters she had written, the contacts she may have maintained among the Protestant lords of the South. She told them what they already knew, that she had no command, no agency, no voice in her husband's rebellion. But it made no difference. Her testimony was not evidence. It was theater. The outcome had been determined from the start. The royal council had already ruled. The Bourbons must be extinguished, not just in law, but in blood. Word of the impending execution spread quickly. In marketplaces and taverns, whispers grew louder. A queen would be made to watch her sons burn. Some disbelieved it. Others delighted in the cruelty. There were those, even among Catholic nobles, who expressed quiet horror, but dared not speak aloud. To question the crown's judgment now was to risk being branded a sympathizer, or worse, a heretic. And so, silence reigned. Within the palace walls, Madeleine begged the bishop for mercy, offered to renounce all claims, to retire to a convent, to never speak her family's name again. He listened, then shook his head. "France needs peace," he said, "and peace requires sacrifice." The sentence was confirmed. At sunrise, her sons would be burned alive in the city square, their mother bound to watch from the scaffold, not to die, but to witness. Witnessing was the point. The fire was not just punishment, it was pedagogy. The morning arrived cloaked in fog. The streets of Rouen filled before dawn, merchants, soldiers, noblewomen, beggars, all drawn to the promise of death. A platform had been erected in the center of the square, and upon it, 2 stakes driven into the wood. Ropes and kindling were arranged with a precision that suggested ritual, not punishment. Madeline was brought forth first, flanked by guards, her wrists chained, her feet bare. She wore no crown, no sign of her former title, only a simple gray tunic and the look of someone who had stared too long into hell. The crowd parted as she was led to the scaffold. She did not resist. Her strength had been consumed by dread. Then came the boys, dragged forward by soldiers, bound at the wrists, eyes wide with terror. The older, perhaps 12, fought back, crying out for his mother. The younger said nothing. He looked only at the sky. The executioner raised his hand and silence fell across the square. Then Madeline screamed. It was not a scream of protest, but of primal horror, the kind that shatters bone and memory alike. She threw herself toward the boys, only to be restrained by 3 men who forced her to her knees. One by one, the children were bound to the stakes. The executioner lit the torch. As the flames caught, Madeleine did not faint. She did not look away. She watched until flesh cracked, until screams turned to silence, until only ash remained where her sons had stood. She watched until there was nothing left to see. Only then did the guards lower her to the ground, unchain her wrists, and carry her away, not to a grave, but to a cloister, where she would live out the rest of her days in silence. She never spoke her sons' names again, not because she forgot them, but because to say them would be to relive the burning. And the fire had already consumed everything. She was placed under the supervision of Dominican nuns, kept in a cell furnished with nothing but a wooden crucifix and a cot. Food was left outside her door. She was forbidden from writing letters, receiving visitors, or leaving the grounds. The official decree declared her cleansed through suffering, an absurdity that masked the cruelty of her confinement. To the outside world, she was dead. Her name was stricken from court records, her family lands redistributed, her memory rewritten. The monarchy issued no apology, no reflection. They had won. The rebellion had been broken, the name of Bourbon shamed and diluted, the people reminded of the price of disobedience. But in cloisters, behind stone walls and locked doors, the Queen remained. Not as a political threat, but as a ghost of the woman she once was. She lived for 17 more years. 17 years of silence. 17 years of replaying the same moment every time she closed her eyes. Some said she had gone mad, that she spoke to shadows and stared for hours at burning candles. Others claimed she achieved peace, that her soul had ascended through penance. But the truth, if it ever existed, was buried with her in an unmarked grave outside the convent walls. No epitaph, no monument. Only rumors whispered among servants and nuns that once there was a queen who watched her sons burn, and that in death she finally joined them in the fire she could never forget. In the years that followed her death, her name vanished from courtly memory like a stone dropped into a well. No echo, no ripple, no inscription on the walls of history that mattered to those who held the pen. The official record, penned by royal scribes and polished by the hands of obedient chroniclers, remembered only that Antoine de Bourbon's rebellion had ended in defeat, and that the punishment had been swift and necessary. The fate of his wife and children was either omitted or wrapped in euphemism, buried beneath phrases like divine retribution and restoration of order. The truth that a mother had been forced to witness the state-sanctioned execution of her own blood was inconvenient, unspeakable, and therefore forgotten. And so, the story faded, eroded by time and silence, surviving only in the margins, in whispered legends passed between midwives and monks, in the haunted eyes of elderly nuns who had once heard her cry in the night. Her sons were not martyrs in the traditional sense. They had died not for faith, nor for glory, but as warnings, as living sacrifices in a kingdom where bloodline could be as damning as belief. But memory has a strange way of surviving the intentions of kings. In remote provinces, among the people whose fields had once been trampled by royal troops, the tale of the burning queen endured, not in records, but in murmurs, in songs stripped of names but not of terror. The fire that consumed her children did not stay contained in Rouen Square. It smoldered in the hearts of those who had seen too much, reminding them that power could masquerade as justice, that the law could be weaponized not to preserve peace, but to destroy dissent. In this way, Madeleine de la Tour d'Auvergne became something else, neither heroine nor villain, but a symbol of what happens when the machinery of state no longer recognizes the boundaries of humanity. Her legacy was not her bloodline, not her titles, but her silence, a silence that screamed through time. The monarchy would go on. Other queens would sit in her place, their hands gloved, their children groomed for succession. The scaffold in Rouen would be dismantled, repurposed for other executions, other enemies of the crown. The fire would be lit again and again for heretics, witches, rebels, each flame pretending to be different, but all of them rooted in the same cold logic, obedience or obliteration. And yet, the image of her on that scaffold, chained and watching, remained embedded in the architecture of history, even if unnamed. In every future purge, every political show trial, every time a regime decided that children were an acceptable price for power, her ghost stood witness, not to interfere, only to remind. Because what makes her story truly unbearable is not only the horror of what was done to her, it is the fact that it was done in full daylight, with the full knowledge and approval of those who called themselves civilized. It is not a story of madness, nor of war, but of policy. The fire that consumed her sons was not born of chaos, but of deliberate calculation, signed by men in robes, sanctioned by prayers, and delivered with the efficiency of a state that knew exactly what it was doing. And that is why it still haunts. Because nothing in her story was accidental. There is no redemption in this tale, no rescue, no poetic twist, no triumph over tyranny. Only fire, only silence, only the unbearable weight of witnessing, and perhaps that is what she gave the world in the end. Not vengeance, not justice, but the unbearable image of a mother watching her children burn, an image so cruel that even history tried to erase it. But memory, like flame, is hard to kill, and some names, even when unspoken, linger in the smoke.